The restaurant sat on the corner of a busy street in downtown Chicago, and most people walked past it without a second glance, but those who stepped inside found something different from the usual dining spots around the city. It was called the Golden Note, and the name made sense the moment you walked through the front door, because right there in the center of the main dining room sat a beautiful black grand piano that caught the light from the chandeliers above. Every evening, a pianist would come in and play soft melodies while guests enjoyed their meals, and the music wrapped around the conversations like a warm blanket, making even ordinary dinners feel special somehow. Working at this restaurant was a young woman named Rosa Delgado, and she had been there for almost 2 years now, carrying plates and taking orders and smiling at customers, even when her feet ached and her back hurt from standing for hours. Rosa was 26 years old, and she had come to America from the Philippines with her mother when she was just 19, and those 7 years had changed everything about her life in ways she never could have imagined back when she was a teenager with big dreams. Back home, she had been someone completely different, and if you had told her younger self that she would end up waitressing at a restaurant in Chicago, she would have laughed and shaken her head, because that was never the plan. Plan had been music. Rosa had started playing piano when she was 5 years old, and her grandmother had been her first teacher, sitting beside her on a wooden bench in their small house in Manila, guiding her tiny fingers across the keys with patience and love. Her grandmother had once been a piano teacher herself, and she saw something special in Rosa from the very beginning, a natural gift that went beyond just hitting the right notes at the right time. By the time Rosa was 12, she had won 3 national competitions, and people in her community called her a prodigy and talked about the great future waiting for her on stages around the world. At 16, she earned a scholarship to one of the best music conservatories in the Philippines, and for 2 years she studied there, learning from masters and practicing until her fingers cramped and her eyes burned from reading sheet music. Everything was going exactly as planned until it wasn't. Father got sick during her 2nd year at the conservatory, and the medical bills piled up faster than anyone could have predicted, and suddenly the family that had always been comfortable found themselves struggling to pay for basic necessities. Rosa wanted to keep studying, but watching her mother work 3 jobs while her father lay in a hospital bed made it impossible to focus on Chopin and Beethoven when real life was falling apart around her. She dropped out of the conservatory to help, and 6 months later, her father passed away, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a family broken by grief and financial stress. That was when her mother made the difficult decision to move to America, where her sister had been living for years, and where she believed they could start fresh and build a new life from the ground up. Rosa remembered the day they left Manila and how she had looked out the airplane window as the Philippines disappeared beneath the clouds, and she knew in her heart that she was leaving more than just a country behind. She was leaving her dreams behind too. The first few years in Chicago were hard in ways Rosa hadn't expected, and her mother worked long hours at a factory while Rosa bounced between minimum wage jobs, trying to help pay rent and put food on the table. There was no time for piano and no money for lessons, and no space in their tiny apartment for an instrument anyway. So Rosa tried to forget that part of herself existed. She told herself it was just a childhood hobby, and that plenty of people give up their dreams when they grow up and face the real world, and she was no different from millions of others who had to make practical choices. But forgetting wasn't as easy as she thought it would be. Sometimes she would walk past music stores and see pianos in the windows, and her fingers would twitch involuntarily, as if they remembered something her mind was trying to forget. Sometimes she would hear a piece of classical music playing somewhere, and tears would spring to her eyes before she could stop them, and she would have to excuse herself and find a quiet place to compose herself. Getting the job at the Golden Note had been both a blessing and a curse, because the money was better than her previous jobs, but working around the piano every single night was torture in a way she couldn't explain to anyone. Every shift, she would watch the house pianist sit down at that beautiful instrument and fill the room with music and something inside. Her chest would tighten like a fist, squeezing her heart. She knew exactly how it felt to sit at a piano like that, and she knew exactly how those keys would respond to her touch, and she knew exactly what it meant to lose yourself in a piece of music until the rest of the world disappeared. But that life belonged to someone else now, and Rosa Delgado, the waitress, had bills to pay and a mother to support, and no business daydreaming about things that could never happen. So she carried her plates and refilled water glasses and smiled at customers and pretended the piano was just furniture and nothing more. There was one customer who came to the Golden Note almost every week, and Rosa had noticed him from his very first visit because he was different from the usual crowd. His name was Theodore Park, and he was 73 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and he always sat at the same corner table near the window, where he could see the whole room. Theodore came alone every time, and he would order the same meal and sit for hours, sometimes just listening to the music and watching people, and there was something peaceful about him that Rosa found comforting. She learned bits and pieces about him over time through small conversations while she served his food and cleared his dishes, and she discovered that he had been a music professor at Northwestern University for over 40 years before retiring. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away 3 years ago, and coming to the Golden Note was his way of staying connected to the world instead of sitting alone in an empty house filled with memories. Theodore was always polite, and he tipped generously, and he never complained about anything, and Rosa liked serving his table because he treated her like a human being instead of just someone bringing him food. What Rosa didn't know was that Theodore had been watching her too, not in a strange way, but in the way that a musician recognizes something in another musician, even when they are trying to hide it from the world. Noticed how Rosa would pause near the piano sometimes when she thought no one was looking, and how her eyes would track the pianist's fingers across the keys with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. Noticed how her own fingers would move slightly against her leg or against the edge of a table, as if playing along with the music in her mind, without even realizing she was doing. I noticed the look on her face when a particularly beautiful passage filled the room, and it was a look he had seen many times before on the faces of his students who truly loved music with their whole souls. Theodore had spent his entire career surrounded by musicians, and he could spot talent and passion from across a room and everything about Rosa told him that this young woman carrying plates and taking orders was not who she was meant to be. But he didn't say anything for a long time because he understood that everyone has their own journey and their own reasons for the choices they make, and it wasn't his place to interfere in a stranger's life until one Friday evening in late October when everything changed. Scheduled pianist had called in sick that afternoon, and the restaurant owner had scrambled to find a replacement. But nobody was available on such short notice, so for the first time in years, the Golden Note was silent. The piano sat there empty and quiet, like a beautiful bird that had forgotten how to sing, and the atmosphere in the restaurant felt different. Somehow, as if something essential was missing. Rosa felt it more than anyone, and she kept glancing at the piano throughout her shift, feeling a strange pull toward it that she couldn't explain and couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried. Theodore noticed this too, and he watched Rosa carefully as she moved through the dining room, and he saw the longing in her eyes every time she looked at that empty bench. And that was when he decided that maybe it was time to say something after all. Theodore waited until Rosa came to his table to refill his water glass before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was gentle, but there was something serious underneath the softness. He asked her to sit down for a moment, and Rosa hesitated because she was working and there were other tables that needed attention, but something in the old man's eyes made her pause. The restaurant was quieter than usual that night, with only about a dozen guests scattered around the dining room and her manager was in the back office dealing with paperwork, so Rosa pulled out the chair across from Theodore and sat on the edge of it ready to jump up if anyone needed her. Theodore looked at her for a long moment before he spoke again, and Rosa felt like he was seeing something she had been trying to hide for years, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. Then he asked her a simple question that made her heart stop. You play piano, don't you? Rosa felt the blood rush to her face, and she laughed, nervously shaking her head and saying she didn't know what he was talking about, and that she was just a waitress trying to make ends meet. But Theodore didn't look away, and he didn't change the subject like most people would have done when faced with such obvious denial. He told her that he had been watching her for months, and he had seen the way she looked at that piano every single night, like someone looking at a lost love they thought they would never see again. Rosa felt her throat tighten, and she wanted to stand up and walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened, but her legs wouldn't move and her voice wouldn't come. Theodore leaned back in his chair, and his eyes grew distant as if he was looking at something far away that only he could see. Started talking about his wife Eleanor and how they had met almost 50 years ago when they were both students at a music school in Boston, and how she had been the most talented pianist he had ever encountered in his entire life. Eleanor had a gift that went beyond technique and training, and when she played, it was like watching someone channel something divine through their fingertips, and everyone who heard her knew they were witnessing something rare and precious. But Eleanor had also been afraid. She was terrified of failure and terrified of judgment, and terrified that one day she would sit down at a piano in front of an audience and her gift would abandon her, and everyone would see that she was a fraud. So instead of pursuing a concert career, she had chosen to teach privately, and she had spent her life helping other pianists achieve the dreams she was too scared to chase for herself. Theodore said that Eleanor had been happy in many ways, and that their life together had been filled with love and music and laughter, and he wouldn't trade those years for anything in the world. But he also said that in her final months, when the illness had taken hold and she knew she didn't have much time left, Eleanor had confessed something to him that had broken his heart. She told him that her biggest regret was never finding out what could have been and never having the courage to sit on a stage and share her gift with the world. Even just once, she had played it safe her whole life, and in the end, she realized that playing it safe had cost her something she could never get back. Theodore looked at Rosa with tears glistening in his eyes, and he said that watching her these past months had reminded him so much of Eleanor because he could see the same fear hiding behind the same longing. Rosa felt tears building in her own eyes, and she tried to blink them away, but one escaped and rolled down her cheek before she could stop it. She told Theodore that he didn't understand her situation and that it wasn't about fear, but about reality and about responsibilities that couldn't be ignored just because she missed playing music. Her mother depended on her, and bills had to be paid, and dreams were luxuries that people like her couldn't afford to chase anymore. Theodore nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she was saying. But then he gestured toward the empty piano sitting silent in the middle of the room. He pointed out that the instrument was just sitting there doing nothing, and that no one was using it, and that playing a few songs wouldn't cost anything or take away from her responsibilities. It was just music, he said, and music wasn't something you could lose money on by sharing it with people who wanted to hear it. Rosa shook her head again and said she hadn't touched a piano in over 3 years, and her skills were probably gone by now, and she would just embarrass herself if she tried to play in front of all these people. Theodore smiled at that and told her that real talent doesn't disappear just because you ignore it for a while, and that music lives in the bones and the blood and the soul, not just in the fingers. He said he had taught thousands of students over his 40-year career, and he had learned to recognize the difference between people who played piano and people who were pianists. Deep down in their core, playing piano was a skill that could be learned and lost, but being a pianist was something you were born with, and it stayed with you forever. whether you wanted it to or not. Rosa was a pianist, he said, and pretending otherwise. It was like a bird pretending it had forgotten how to fly. The words hit Rosa somewhere deep in her chest, and she felt something crack open inside her that she had been keeping sealed shut for years. She thought about her grandmother and those early lessons in Manila and the way music had once made her feel like she could touch something beautiful and eternal and true. She thought about her father and how proud he had been of her talent, and how he used to sit in the audience at her competitions, with tears streaming down his face every single time. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to convince herself that music didn't matter anymore, and how exhausting it had been to carry that lie around with her every single day. Theodore reached across the table and placed his hand gently on top of hers, and his skin was paper thin and spotted with age, but his grip was warm and steady. He told her that life was shorter than anyone ever believed it would be, and that the things we regret most are usually not the things we did, but the things we were too afraid to try. He said he wasn't asking her to quit her job or abandon her mother or do anything irresponsible, but he was asking her to walk over to that piano and sit down and play something, just one song, just this once. If she hated it, she never had to do it again, and he would never bring it up, and everything could go back to exactly the way it was before. But if she loved it, then maybe, just maybe, she would realize that some dreams don't have to die just because life gets hard. Rosa looked at the piano across the room, and it seemed both very close and very far away at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down at water that might be shallow or might be deep enough to catch you. Her manager walked out of the back office at that moment and noticed Rosa sitting at a customer's table, and he started to say something, but then he saw the expression on her face and stopped. He was a decent man who had always treated Rosa fairly, and he could tell that something important was happening, even if he didn't understand exactly what it was. Theodore looked up at him and explained that the restaurant felt empty without music tonight, and that he had a feeling this young woman might be able to help with that if she was willing. The manager looked confused for a second, but then he shrugged and said that honestly, it would be nice to have some background music, and if Rosa wanted to play something, she was welcome to give it a shot. He said it in a casual way, like it was no big deal either way, and Rosa appreciated that because it took some of the pressure off. Even though her heart was still pounding in her chest, she looked at Theodore, and then at the piano, and then at her own hands, which were trembling slightly against the white tablecloth. Everything inside her was screaming two different things at the same time, with one voice telling her to stay safe and keep her head down and not risk humiliation in front of strangers. But another voice was whispering something else entirely, and it sounded like her grandmother and her father, and maybe even like the young girl she used to be before life taught her to stop believing in impossible things. Rosa stood up slowly, and her legs felt weak and unsteady beneath her, like she was learning to walk all over again after a long time of sitting still. Theodore smiled at her with such warmth and encouragement that she almost started crying again, but she held it together and took a deep breath and started walking toward the piano. Each step felt like it took forever, and she was aware of every sound in the room and every pair of eyes that might be watching her, and every doubt that was screaming at her to turn back before it was too late. But she kept walking anyway, because somewhere underneath all the fear there was something else that had been waiting for this moment for 3 very long years. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, just looking at the keys and remembering what it felt like to be the girl who believed music could change everything. Then she pulled out the bench and sat down and placed her fingers on the keys and felt the cool, smooth surface beneath her fingertips, like greeting an old friend she thought she had lost forever. Rosa sat at the piano bench, and for a moment she couldn't move at all, and her hands just hovered above the keys like they were frozen in midair. The bench felt different from what she remembered, and the height wasn't quite right, and everything about the situation felt strange and unfamiliar, even though she had done this thousands of times. Before in another life, she could feel eyes on her back, and she knew that some of the guests in the restaurant had noticed her sitting down at the piano and were probably wondering what this waitress in her black uniform thought she was doing. Her mind went completely blank and she couldn't remember a single piece of music, and all those years of training and practice seemed to vanish like smoke in the wind, leaving nothing behind. But empty space. Panic started rising in her chest, and she thought about standing up and walking away and apologizing to everyone and going back to her tables where she belonged, and where nobody expected anything from her except water refills and correct orders. But then she felt Theodore watching her from across the room, and she remembered his words about his wife and about regret and about dreams that die, not because they fail, but because we never give them a chance to succeed. Rosa closed her eyes and took a deep breath and tried to quiet the noise in her head, and somewhere in the silence, she heard her grandmother's voice speaking to her in Tagalog, the way she used to during those early lessons in Manila. Her grandmother always said that music doesn't come from the mind, but from somewhere deeper, and that when you try too hard to think about what you're playing, you lose the connection to the thing that makes it beautiful. She used to tell Rosa to stop thinking and start feeling, and to let her hands remember what her brain had forgotten. So Rosa stopped trying to choose a piece, and stopped trying to remember notes, and stopped trying to be perfect. And instead, she just let her fingers fall where they wanted to fall. The first note rang out into the quiet restaurant, and it was a single sound hanging in the air, like a question waiting for an answer. Then came another note and another, and slowly a melody began to form, and Rosa realized that her hands were playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the very first classical piece her grandmother had ever taught her. Beginning was rough, and her fingers stumbled over passages that used to flow like water, and she hit a wrong note that made her wince and want to stop and hide. But she kept going anyway, because stopping felt worse than making mistakes, and because somewhere underneath the rust and the fear, the music was still there waiting to be found. Something strange started happening after the first minute or so, and Rosa felt the stiffness in her hands begin to soften, and her fingers started moving with more confidence, like they were waking up from a long sleep. The muscle memory that Theodore had talked about was real, and it was coming back to her piece by piece, and note by note, like blood flowing into a limb that had gone numb. She stopped thinking about the people watching her, and stopped worrying about making mistakes, and stopped caring about anything except the music pouring out of her fingertips. The Nocturne was a piece about longing and loss and beauty found in darkness, and Rosa had always connected with it deeply, but now it meant something different than it had when she was a teenager. Now she understood what real loss felt like, and what real sacrifice meant, and what it was like to give up something you loved for something you loved even more. She played for her father, who had believed in her talent until his very last breath, and who had worked himself to exhaustion trying to give her opportunities he never had. She played for her mother, who had left everything behind to start over in a foreign country, and who had never once complained about the hard work and the long hours and the dreams she had given up for her daughter. She played for her grandmother, who had seen something special in a 5-year-old girl, and had nurtured that gift with patience and wisdom and unconditional love. She played for the 19-year-old version of herself, who had boarded that plane to America with tears streaming down her face, knowing she was leaving behind the only future she had ever imagined. She played for Theodore and for Eleanor, and for everyone who had ever been too afraid to try, and who had learned too late that fear is a terrible reason to let beautiful things die. Music filled the restaurant, and it wasn't just sound anymore, but something alive and breathing that wrapped around everyone in the room and made them stop whatever they were doing. A couple near the window had been in the middle of an argument about something small and stupid, and they both fell silent and turned to look at the young waitress, who was creating something extraordinary out of thin, airy businessmen who had been checking his phone and barely paying attention to his surroundings, put the device down on the table and leaned back in his chair and let the music wash over him. A mother with 2 young children who had been stressed and exhausted from a long day felt the tension drain out of her shoulders as the nocturne spoke to something deep inside her soul. The kitchen staff heard the music through the swinging doors, and one by one they emerged to stand in the doorway and watch with wide eyes and open mouths. Even the manager, who had casually given Rosa permission to play, found himself frozen in place. Unable to look away from what was happening in front of him, Rosa was no longer a waitress sitting at a piano, but something else entirely, and the transformation was visible to everyone watching her. Posture had changed, and her face had changed, and there was a light in her expression that hadn't been there before, like someone who had been holding their breath for years and was finally able to exhale. The nocturne built toward its emotional peak, and Rosa's fingers moved across the keys with a passion and precision that seemed impossible for someone who claimed to be out of practice. Tears were streaming down her face. But she didn't stop, and she didn't wipe them away, and she let them fall onto the keys as she played, because the tears were part of the music. Too, they were tears of grief for everything she had lost, and tears of joy for everything she was finding again, and tears of relief that the thing inside her she had tried so hard to kill was still alive after all. Outside, on the street, people walking past the restaurant slowed down when they heard the music drifting through the windows, and some of them stopped completely and pressed their faces against the glass to see where such beautiful sound was coming from. A young man who had been rushing somewhere important forgot where he was going and stood on the sidewalk, listening with his eyes closed and a peaceful expression on his face. An elderly woman with a cane who had been shuffling along slowly stopped and smiled because the music reminded her of her childhood and of concerts her parents used to take her to decades ago. The nocturne reached its final passages, and Rosa played the last notes with a tenderness that made several people in the restaurant gasp quietly. The final chord hung in the air for what felt like forever, and then slowly faded into silence, and for a long moment nobody moved and nobody spoke. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then theater started clapping, and the sound broke the spell, and suddenly everyone in the restaurant was applauding, and the kitchen staff was cheering, and people were standing up from their tables. Rosa opened her eyes and looked around in confusion, like she was waking up from a dream and didn't quite understand where she was or what had just happened. She saw the faces looking at her with amazement and admiration, and she saw Theodore smiling through his tears, and she saw her manager staring at her like he had never seen her before. The applause kept going, and someone whistled, and someone else called out "beautiful," and Rosa didn't know what to do with any of it, because this wasn't supposed to happen. She was just a waitress who had played a song to make an old man happy, and somehow it had turned into something much bigger than she ever could have imagined. Rosa wiped her face with the back of her hand and tried to compose herself, but her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding, and she felt like she might collapse if she tried to stand up. Theodore made his way across the restaurant, moving slowly with his cane, and when he reached the piano, he placed his hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. He didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said, and they both understood that something important had just happened, and that nothing would ever be quite the same again. But neither of them knew that the most life-changing moment of the evening was still about to happen, and that someone else in the restaurant had been watching Rosa with very different intentions than anyone could have guessed. The applause slowly died down, and Rosa sat at the piano bench trying to catch her breath and make sense of what had just happened to her. Her body felt different, like she had been carrying a heavy weight for years without realizing it, and someone had finally lifted it off her shoulders. Theodore stood beside her with his hand still resting gently on her shoulder, and she could see that he was crying too, and that made her feel less embarrassed about her own tears. The other guests in the restaurant started going back to their meals and their conversations, but there was a different energy in the room now, and people kept glancing over at Rosa with curious expressions. She knew she should get up and go back to work because she was still on the clock, and there were tables that needed attention, and she couldn't just sit at the piano all night. But before she could stand up, she noticed a woman walking toward her from a table near the back of the restaurant, and something about the way this woman moved made Rosa pay attention. The woman looked to be in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant style, and she was dressed in expensive-looking clothes that suggested she was someone important. She had a presence about her that was hard to describe, and when she walked, it was with the confidence of someone who was used to being in charge and having people listen when she spoke. Rosa had noticed this woman earlier in the evening when she first came in and sat alone at her table ordering just a glass of wine and an appetizer. She had seemed distracted and tired, like she had a lot on her mind, and Rosa had assumed she was just another business person unwinding after a long day. But now this woman was standing right in front of the piano, looking at Rosa with an intensity that made her nervous. The woman introduced herself, and her name was Catherine Rias, and she said she was the artistic director of the Lakeshore Chamber Orchestra, which was one of the most respected music organizations in the FARS. And the most was one of the most respected music organizations in the bargizations in the nation. Midwest. Rosa felt her stomach drop because she had heard of the Lakeshore Chamber Orchestra, and she knew they performed at major venues and worked with world-class musicians. She couldn't understand why someone like that would want to talk to a waitress who had just played one song on a restaurant piano. Catherine pulled over a chair and sat down facing Rosa, and she spoke in a voice that was warm but also very direct. She said she had come to the restaurant tonight because she needed to get away from her office and clear her head after a frustrating day of meetings and budget discussions. She had planned to have a quiet dinner alone and think about nothing important, and then go home and get some sleep before another long week. But then she had heard Rosa play, and everything else had faded away, and she had found herself unable to think about anything except the music filling the room. Catherine said she had been working in classical music for over 30 years, and she had heard thousands of pianists perform, everything from student recitals to sold-out concerts at Carnegie Hall. She knew the difference between someone who played well and someone who had something special, and she told Rosa that what she had just witnessed was something genuinely extraordinary. Rosa shook her head and tried to explain that she was out of practice and that she had made several mistakes and that it was just one piece she happened to remember from her childhood. But Catherine held up her hand and stopped her and said that technical perfection was not what made a performance memorable. She said there were plenty of pianists in the world who could play every note perfectly and never miss a beat and hit every dynamic marking exactly as written, but most of them played like machines, and their performances were impressive but forgettable because they were missing the one thing that couldn't be taught or learned from a book. That thing was soul, and it was the ability to make people feel something deep in their hearts when they listened. And it was the rarest gift a musician could possess. Catherine said Rosa had that gift in abundance, and she could see it from the first note to the last. And she would be a fool to let someone with that kind of talent continue carrying plates for a living. Rosa felt dizzy and overwhelmed, and she looked over at Theodore, who was watching the conversation with a huge smile on his face, like he had known something like this was going to happen. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out business card and handed it to Rosa and told her to call the number on Monday morning. She explained that the orchestra was planning a special showcase concert in 6 months featuring emerging artists, and she wanted Rosa to audition for one of the performance slots. It wouldn't be a huge audience, and it wouldn't be a major venue, but it would be a real concert with professional musicians and serious music lovers in attendance. Rosa stared at the business card in her hand, and the letters seemed to blur because her eyes were filling with tears again. She tried to explain her situation and told Catherine that she hadn't studied formally in years, and that she didn't have time to practice because she worked full-time and supported her mother. She said she was grateful for the kind words, but she couldn't possibly audition for something like that because she would only embarrass herself and waste everyone's time. Catherine nodded like she had expected this response, and then she leaned forward and spoke in a softer voice. She told Rosa about her own story and how she had grown up poor in a small town in Texas with parents who didn't understand why she wanted to study music instead of getting a real job. She had worked 2 jobs while attending community college and then transferred to a university on scholarships and loans and spent years paying off debt while building her career. She said she knew exactly what it felt like to believe that dreams were luxuries only rich people could afford, and that practical responsibilities had to come before personal desires. But she also said that sometimes life puts opportunities in front of us, and we have to decide whether we are going to grab them or let them pass by. She told Rosa that she wasn't offering her a recording contract or a world tour, but just a chance to audition and a chance to see what might be possible if she stopped telling herself no before anyone else had the chance to say yes. The restaurant manager had been watching all of this from nearby, and he walked over and introduced himself to Catherine, and they shook hands. He told Rosa that he had no idea she could play like that, and he asked why she had never mentioned it in all the time she had worked there. Rosa shrugged and said it never seemed relevant because she was hired to be a waitress, not a musician. The manager looked at her for a long moment and then made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He offered Rosa a new position at the Positas restaurant, playing piano on Friday and Saturday evenings, and he said he would pay her the same hourly rate as her waitressing shifts. He said he had been wanting to have live music more regularly anyway, and having someone on staff who could play would be much easier than hiring outside performers. Rosa couldn't believe what she was hearing, and she looked back and forth between the manager and Catherine and Theodore like she was waiting for someone to tell her this was all a joke. But nobody was laughing, and everyone was looking at her with expectation and hope, and she realized that the universe was handing her something she had never dared to ask for. Theodore stepped forward and put both hands on her shoulders and looked her straight in the eyes. He told her that Eleanor would have loved this moment, and that watching Rosa play had been like watching his wife finally get the chance she never gave herself. He said life was too short to let fear make decisions for us, and that Rosa had already proven tonight that she still had everything she needed to pursue her dream. All she had to do now was say yes. Rosa looked down at the business card in her hand, and then up at the piano keys that had just changed her life, and then out at the restaurant full of strangers who had witnessed her transformation. She thought about her mother at home, probably watching television and waiting for Rosa to finish her shift, and she wondered what her mother would say when she heard about all of this. She thought about her father and how proud he would be if he could see her right now, and she could almost feel his presence in the room, cheering her on. She thought about the little girl in Manila who had first touched piano keys at 5 years old, and had never imagined that her journey would take so many twists and turns. And finally, she thought about the woman she wanted to become and whether she was brave enough to take the first step toward meeting her. Rosa took a deep breath and looked at Catherine and nodded her head. She said she would call on Monday, and she would audition, and she would give it everything she had, even if she was terrified, and even if she failed. Catherine smiled and stood up and shook Rosa's hand firmly and told her she was making the right choice. Then she walked back to her table to finish her wine, and Rosa was left sitting at the piano, surrounded by people who believed in her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and questions and phone numbers exchanged, and Rosa felt like she was floating through it all in a daze. When her shift finally ended, she walked out of the restaurant into the cold night air and stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the stars. Everything was exactly the same as it had been that morning, and also completely different, and Rosa knew that whatever happened next, her life would never go back to the way it was before. She pulled out her phone and called her mother, and when she answered, Rosa started crying and laughing at the same time. She had so much to tell her, and she didn't know where to begin. 6 months had passed since that Friday night at the Golden Note, and Rosa stood backstage at the Whitmore Concert Hall, looking at herself in a mirror she barely recognized. That woman staring back at her was wearing a deep burgundy gown that her mother had spent 3 weeks sewing by hand, working late into the night after her factory shifts to make sure every stitch was perfect. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore simple pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother and had traveled all the way from Manila to Chicago, tucked inside her mother's suitcase. In 20 minutes, she would walk onto that stage and perform her debut recital in front of 300 people, and the thought made her stomach twist with a mixture of terror and excitement. The past 6 months had been the hardest and most rewarding of her entire life, and there were moments when she had wanted to give up and go back to the safety of her old routine. She had continued working at the restaurant, playing piano on weekends and waitressing during the week to pay the bills while practicing 4 hours every single day. Catherine had connected her with a piano teacher named Mr. Hoffman, who was a retired professor and one of the most demanding instructors Rosa had ever encountered. He pushed her harder than anyone had pushed her since her conservatory days, and there were lessons where she left his studio in tears, feeling like she would never be good enough. But Mr. Hoffman also believed in her with a ferocity that surprised her, and he refused to let her make excuses or settle for anything less than her absolute best. He told her that talent without discipline was worthless and that she had wasted 3 years feeling sorry for herself. And now she had to work twice as hard to make up for lost time. Those words stung, but Rosa knew he was right, and she threw herself into her practice with an intensity that left her exhausted, but also more alive than she had felt in years. Her mother had cried when Rosa told her about what happened that night at the restaurant, and about the opportunity Catherine had offered her. She had hugged Rosa tight and said that her father was watching from heaven, and that he had always known this day would come. Even when Rosa had stopped believing it herself, her mother had insisted on picking up extra shifts at the factory so Rosa would have more time to practice, and Rosa had protested, but her mother refused to listen. She said that parents sacrifice for their children, and that seeing Rosa chase her dream again was worth more than any amount of rest or comfort. The audition for the showcase concert had been terrifying, and Rosa had walked into that room with shaking hands and a dry mouth, convinced she was about to humiliate herself. But when she sat down at the piano, something clicked into place, and she played like she had never played before. And when she finished, the panel of judges had looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Catherine had called her 2 days later to tell her she had been selected, and Rosa had screamed so loud that her neighbors probably thought something was wrong. The months of preparation that followed were grueling, and Rosa learned pieces she had never attempted before and pushed her technique further than she thought possible. There were setbacks along the way, including a week where her wrist hurt so badly she couldn't practice, and she thought she might have to drop out of the concert entirely. But she rested and recovered and came back stronger and more determined, and Mr. Hoffman said that setbacks were part of every musician's journey, and that the great ones learned from them instead of being defeated by them. Now here she was, backstage at a real concert hall, about to perform for a real audience, and everything she had worked for was about to be tested. A knock came at her dressing room door, and Rosa opened it to find Theodore standing there in a sharp black suit, looking more elegant than she had ever seen him. He was holding a single white rose, and he handed it to her with a smile that made his whole face glow. He told her that he had reserved 2 seats in the front row, and that one was for him and the other was for Eleanor. Rosa felt tears prick her eyes, and she hugged the old man who had changed her life with one simple question on a quiet Friday night. Theodore whispered in her ear that he was proud of her, and that Eleanor would be proud too, and that no matter what happened out there tonight, she had already won. They stood there for a moment in silence, and Rosa thought about how strange life could be, and how the smallest moments could lead to the biggest changes. If the regular pianist hadn't called in sick that night, she would still be carrying plates and hiding from her dreams. If Theodore hadn't been brave enough to ask her that question, she would never have sat down at that piano. If Catherine hadn't happened to choose that particular restaurant on that particular evening, none of this would be happening. It was like the universe had conspired to give her a second chance. And all she had to do was be brave enough to take out. A stagehand appeared and told Rosa it was time, and she took a deep breath and squeezed Theodore's hand one last time before walking toward the stage entrance. The lights in the concert hall dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience, and Rosa could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a drum. She walked out onto the stage, and the spotlight hit her, and for a moment she couldn't see anything except white light and shadows. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw the sea of faces looking up at her, and she saw Theodore in the front row with the empty seat beside him where the white rose now rested. She saw her mother sitting a few rows back, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, already crying. Before a single note had been played, she saw Catherine standing near the back of the hall with her arms crossed and a confident smile on her face, like she had known all along that this moment would come. Rosa walked to the piano and sat down on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys, and everything fell away except the music waiting to be born. She had chosen to open with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece she had played that night at the restaurant, and the same piece her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. It felt right to begin where everything had started, and to honor the journey by returning to its origin. The first notes rang out into the concert hall, and they were pure and clear and filled with everything Rosa had learned and lost and found again. She played with a confidence she hadn't possessed 6 months ago, and a technique that had been sharpened by countless hours of practice, and a soul that had been cracked open and healed and made stronger in the breaking. The audience sat in complete stillness as the music washed over them, and Rosa could feel their attention, like a physical presence wrapping around her and lifting her up. She thought about her grandmother and the wooden bench in Manila, and the way those wrinkled hands had guided her tiny fingers across the keys with such patience and love. She thought about her father and the pride in his eyes every time she performed, and how she wished more than anything that he could be here to see this moment. She thought about the girl who had given up and the woman who had found the courage to try again, and she realized they were both part of her and always would be. Nocturne reached its final phrases, and Rosa played the closing notes with a tenderness that seemed to stop time itself. The last chord faded into silence, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened, and Rosa wondered if she had somehow failed. Then the audience erupted into applause, and people were standing up and cheering, and Rosa saw her mother sobbing openly, and Theodore clapping with tears streaming down his face. Stood up from the piano and took a bow, and the applause kept going, and she didn't know what to do with all the emotion flooding through her body. She looked out at the crowd, and she saw strangers who had been moved by her music, and she understood for the first time what her grandmother had meant when she said that music was a gift you gave to the world. Rosa played 3 more pieces that night, and each one was received with the same enthusiasm, and by the end of the concert she knew that her life had changed forever. Backstage afterward, she was surrounded by people congratulating her and asking about her background and wanting to know where she had trained and how they could hear her play again. Catherine pushed through the crowd and hugged her and said that this was just the beginning, and that there would be more concerts and more opportunities and more chances to share her gift. Theodore waited patiently until the crowd thinned out, and then he approached Rosa with Eleanor's white rose in his hand. told her that his wife had finally gotten her concert and that watching Rosa perform had healed something in his heart that had been broken for 3 years. Rosa took the rose and held it close to her chest and thanked him for everything he had done and for seeing something in her that she had forgotten existed. Her mother appeared and wrapped her arms around Rosa and held her tight and whispered in Tagalog that her father was smiling down from heaven tonight. They stood there together in the backstage hallway, and Rosa realized that this moment was not an ending but a beginning. She had spent years believing that her dreams were dead and that practical life had won and that music was something she used to do, but now she understood that dreams don't die just because we stop chasing them and that they wait for us patiently in the shadows until we find the courage to reach for them again. Rosa Delgado, the waitress, had become Rosa Delgado, the pianist, and she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would never stop playing again, because music was not just something she did, but something she was, and always had been, and always would be. And somewhere in the melody she could hear her grandmother's voice whispering in Tagalog, "This is who you were always meant to be."